Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Ljubovic. I'm senior lecturer at School of Education. My research is in learning technologies and all things around it. I'm also the leader for the special interest group, Technology and Pedagogy, which is actually the sort of the host, if you like, conceptual host for this talk today. This talk today is a product of sort of collaboration between a presenter and myself and a few people around in terms of how we can bring some nice and interesting things together from our research into practice. About the main presenter, Natasa Lackovic is based at the Department of Educational Research at Lancaster University. She's a co-director of the Center for Higher Education Research and Evaluation and also co-directs Lancaster University's network focusing on graphic media and teaching, research and engagement. Today she will present an area of her research, the pedagogic and research method that she termed inquiry graphics and recently published book titled Inquiry Graphics in Higher Education. So over to you, Natasha.
It's great to be here with you today, and I hope that this session would be useful in terms of your teaching as well as research, albeit I will be talking about research just a little bit at the end of the presentation. So I'm focusing really on multimodal teaching today. But of course, if you are interested, we can organize something later on. You never know what can happen with this. So the next thing that I would like to say is really about the schedule for today. So I will be talking, as I mentioned, about inquiry graphics, and as Dan mentioned, as practice. And this practice is actually the practice of applied semiotics. Inquiry graphics is also a theoretical approach that embeds pragmatic semiotics and learning sciences. But yes, the focus today is really on the practical side of it. So I will first present for about 45 minutes on the use of inquiry graphics in teaching and learning. Then I would expect a little bit of group discussion and feedback. So 15 minutes of discussion and feedback, then a few words about inquiry graphics in research, and then again we will have a little bit of group discussion, questions and answers, and a bit of feedback. Okay, and this is the cover of the book that was published last year, with Palgrave Macmillan. Okay, so the first question would be, what is multimodal teaching and research? What is multimodality? So multimodality is an interdisciplinary approach that understands communication, representation, and therefore learning, because communication and representation are closely linked to learning, to be more than just about language as a mode of communication, but other modes such as visual design, pictures, symbols, body, and we refer here to touch and gesture, sound, sensory experiences, and so on. So we're talking here about a particular meaning of modes and modalities. So these are modes. Language is a mode, picture is a type of mode, touch is a type of mode, etc. Now, multimodality provides concepts, methods, and frameworks for the collection and analysis of these different modalities, such as linguistic, visual, oral, embodied, and spatial aspects of interaction and environments, and of course the relationship between these. Now, the question that I'm asking you to reflect now, to start reflecting, that I hope would emerge when we start discussing, how is your discipline or your program or your course where you teach multimodal, visual, or material? So this is a kind of question to open a conversation and open your kind of energize your thinking before we break. What are inquiry graphics, you may ask? And I am asked very often this question. So inquiry graphics, simply put, are graphics used or problematized in teaching and research to act as central part of knowledge learning or research inquiry and development. And I'm saying central because usually graphics, which are photographs, other types of visual media such as videos, hybrid medias, collage. We can talk about graphics in motion or static graphics. They can be often used as illustration or decorations rather than really central part of a learning inquiry or even a research inquiry. So although they're routinely used in teaching or research, how are they actually tackled? What is their role? How are they analyzed? What is their meaning? What is their purpose and their value? So in more familiar terms, and I'm sure you will be familiar with some of these approaches and perspectives as well as theories, when considering teaching and learning, inquiry graphics can be connected to inquiry learning with graphic visual media. So that's connected to John Dewey's work, and you know that John Dewey wrote about the value of visual media, the value of art in thinking processes. Then visual thinking strategies, visual learning, thinking visually, all different terms and their authors in these domains. Then critical, reflective, creative thinking with, again, graphic visual media. So we're turning everything or pairing everything with graphic visual media. Then metacognition with graphic visual media. So how to think about learning, to think about thinking with these visual media. Threshold concepts with graphic and visual media, which I'm also formulating as threshold graphics. So if you are not familiar with this area, you may wish to read further, such as the work by Ray Land and Julie Rattray. Then conversation framework that I will be focusing on today with graphic visual media that originated in the work by Gordon Pask and then developed by Diane Laurillard. So this is actually what I will be presenting and illustrating today. So I'm not just kind of giving a list of things that I will not illustrate and actually use graphic media and images in this talk. Of course I will, and you will see very soon. So what types of graphics are we talking about? So we're talking about graphics that are still and also in motion. Some examples: photographs, illustrations, maps, videos, graphs, drawings, animation, web pages, social media. Today, I would like to focus on photographs, but you may wish to think about these different types of graphics. And of course, some types of graphics would be more suitable for particular analysis than others. That is also quite expected. Anyway, a couple of illustrations of the books that I find relevant and also that served as a form of inspiration for developing inquiry graphics. So you can see here John Dewey's Art as Experience, Stephen Reed's Thinking Visually, Gunter Kress's and Theo van Leeuwen's Reading Images, then Threshold Concepts as a way to transform learning or have that transformational learning experience. Then, of course, about multimodality, introducing multimodality, and rethinking university teaching by Laurillard that is linked to the conversational framework I will present and illustrate in a moment. Okay, so here is then the framework, the cycle, and inquiry graphics pedagogic strategy. I call it an image-based concept inquiry cycle, and I would map examples onto different learning types or acts. And you will then see these different learning types and acts as I present the cycle. And I would like also to mention that I'm aware that Dejan uses the conversational framework in his teaching, and he refers often to these different learning types. So if there is anyone, any of students that have experienced that, then I would think that you will be familiar when I start talking about these different learning types and illustrating them through the cycle. So here it is. there are five distinct steps in this image-based concept inquiry cycle. The first one is focusing on identifying a learning objective or concept in your teaching, and it links to the learning type of acquisition. So acquisition is mostly when students are reading, watching, engaging with something in a form of kind of consuming information. And what this step means is the following: the teacher chooses a concept, a question, a challenge. It can be a topic, a theory, a problem that they wish their students, or you wish your students, to reflect deeply on. And you can also decide with students which concepts they're struggling with, but you can also know that from your experience. So this is linked also to threshold concepts in disciplines that are actually the concept that are essential for students to move forward in their learning, but usually they are struggling with those concepts. Right, and then I will give you just one example, because you may think, okay, what do you mean by concepts? So in educational psychology, one such example is constructivism. So let's say learners in the field of educational psychology and psychology in general would need to familiarize themselves with this concept of constructivism as a theory, where it comes from, what it is, etc. So you would know of different concepts in your own teaching and in your own discipline. The next stage that happens is the focus on image, where you ask students to do a little bit of investigation and production. So these are two more different learning types, and you would encourage students to explore different resources about the concept and then find or create an image that represent an aspect of that concept from their point of view and building on any readings. And when I say an aspect of the concept, this is really to stress that there is no single image, not a single image that actually really represents a concept. That is not possible. One image cannot represent a concept, but what it can represent, it can represent one aspect of that concept. And I will talk about that and illustrate these examples in a moment, what I really mean by that. Then the next thing after selecting and searching for that image is related to providing support to students how to actually do this investigation and image selection. So how to translate from the concept to an image. And I will be talking about different approaches and aspects to do that with this guiding question of what type of image and how to relate this image to the concept. So here is a little gallery of different ways or different aspects of the concept of constructivism. So these are image examples, and some of the images may speak to learners or may speak to you more easily than others, but that really depends on which aspect to the concept and image you take. And I have also prepared some handouts that can help with this. So you can see there is a person here doing some gardening, then there are children doing a little bit of chemistry experiment. Then there is a scaffolding as a type of a metaphor that is very much a sub-concept of constructivism. Then there is a DNA helix model. Then there is this black and white image of 19th century theater, where you can see a dissection of a cadaver, and that was a very common demonstration in terms of learning at that time in this specific space and in this specific way. And then you also have the teacher and the student there in the background. So to what extent, we can acknowledge and consider teacher and students' roles. So now I will move on to talk further about these different ways of representing this image and how we actually came up, or how I devised these different categories to illustrate these different aspects. So I will be talking about 11 image concept types, and I will be illustrating them through photographs. These types are not exhaustive, they're not definitive, they can be expanded, but they need to have some set of we need to have some set of categories to exemplify to our students, and also there needs to be some sort of a support so that we can think more deeply about the images and how to bring together images and concepts. This typology builds on visual culture and rhetoric and social culture and expansive view of concepts, and you will see what I mean by that just by showing you the illustrations as follows. So you can recognize the images here. So the first orientation is basically thinking about everyday activity, personal experience. So you're encouraging students to ask particular concept questions, such as, can the concept be identified in some everyday or very familiar routine event, place, activity, state, or artifact, but it has to come from their personal experience. So something that is familiar to the learner. The content then would be a depiction that would show that familiar context or experience or a snapshot or a situation, personal episode. And the example here is a depiction of a gardening activity. So if learners themselves or someone else, they know engage in gardening, then how is this constructivist? This would involve, for example, specialized knowledge and routines, and they develop by learning action or reflection. Usually you're developing this knowledge on your own, and today we're familiar with a lot of YouTube based instruction videos where people learn through constructing that um, knowledge on their own, and then they experiment in the real world. So to what extent is this kind of learning constructivist? Then the challenging approach is based on the concept question: how can we define and subsequently challenge the concept boundaries? So we know by definition what constructivism is, as it will be shown in this iconic representation, but can we challenge it? Can we move the boundaries? So the content would be then a depiction that shows less obvious and unusual realization and kind of embodiment of the concept. And although this is not obvious, we can still ask questions and explore, and also ask, what is not constructivism, what could be constructivism, is there constructivist experience? So this example is, as I said, depiction of a 19th century cadaver dissection lesson. And we could say that learners are not apparently participating in this principled action, but they're maybe vicariously doing so by observation. So to what extent observation is this kind of constructive experience, and how? So there is a discussion to be developed here, and also with the help and moderated by the tutor. The iconic representation is, I think, something that would show a very familiar, very iconic, very stereotypical, conventional meaning of the concept. So the depiction would be a classic instance of the concept understanding. And like here, you see children independently shown to engage with materials in some sort of a lab, and they're doing this and having this hands-on experience, which is very typical of constructivism, having this hands-on experience, discovering, creating meanings on your own independently. Okay, so moving on, the contrast, if you remember the guide from the side, would be then in the children's example, but here is more kind of sage on the stage metaphor. So the teacher is lecturing, and then the student is learning somewhere there, kind of observing, sitting. So what is the opposite of the classical constructivist idea? And the image content there would be a depiction that actually embodies this oppositional concept. So you can then create discussion about these contrasts, these differences. So supposed opposites, idea of hands-on active learning experience. So that would be transmission format of teaching. The metaphor is the next one, and you would recognize the scaffolding image here. So how can we metaphorically represent the concept? So let's say if we think of scaffolding, this would be a metaphor in constructivist learning. And what scaffolding means is basically how teachers decide to support or scaffold learning activities. So, you know, they need all the time to negotiate their involvement and when and to what extent to be involved so that the constructivist experience can happen. Example here is a building construction, teams of workers. So you can think metaphorically about what each means. But of course, we also need to challenge metaphors, because metaphors not only show metaphorical ideas of concepts, but they also are limited in what they show, and sometimes they can even be misleading. So metaphors are powerful, and we need to encourage students to think about how misleading they are as well, because scaffolding are very that they're supposed to be there and then be removed if we build a house. But scaffolding in the sense of constructivism is this kind of cognitive support that stays there, that is supposed to be embedded in cognitive schemata. So you can stress these differences in terms of what is misleading, or, you know, just the nature of the scaffolding, etc. Uh, then the other aspect is cause or prerequisites. So what conditions are the prerequisite? What is needed so that the concept develop or occurs, or that it can be understood? And then the depiction would be showing some sort of condition for that. And here we have a lab and a lab equipment that is usually a precondition for having an experience of experimenting in a lab. And this also raises a lot of questions, especially in current circumstances, you know, how to recreate these lab conditions. But also it raises a question of resources, to what extent some environments have resources and some others environments don't. Then three more, and then we're left with two more. So the outcome orientation is what happens after the concept is applied. So what are the outcomes? What is the goal of the process of application or experiencing the concept? So the depiction would show what might happen as a goal or a result, etc. So here is a DNA model, DNA helix model from some component parts. So the students engage together in designing and constructing it, and now the model is there to show or evidence what they have been working on. Then the focus can be on an object, on something that is maybe considered to be a very important part or very important thing for the concept. And here I chose a depiction of a logo programming output. It can be also linked to outcome, of course, because there are no kind of very strict boundaries also between these types and categories. And a lot of people would say that logo programming is actually an example of constructionism. But yeah, we can talk about that. So place or context is another aspect. So the concept question would be, how is this concept influenced by different contexts, different places, different environments? And the image would remind us of these different contextual embeddings of concepts or problems and experiences. So we can just change it. Is it social? Is it work related? Is it happening outside in the nature, leisure environments, etc.? So we can just play with it. And the example here is a depiction of a classroom context, and then teacher-student interactions as, again, something that is a typical context, so it can be linked to the iconic representation. And finally, the last two are linked to taking time-based or historical approach to concept and the cultural, socio-cultural approach to concept. So the question for the time history would be, how has the concept changed over time? Can we investigate it and maybe create timelines? So the content would be depiction that shows something about the historical development of the concept, approach or seen from the past and relate to now. So here's a depiction of a human screen interaction in the 1980s, and learning has over time migrated and developed from this type of technology and this type of interaction, but it also hasn't. So what has changed and what hasn't changed is an interesting question here historically over time. And then the focus on culture, the concept question would be, how is the concept manifested in different cultural settings and influenced by different culture and sociocultural particularities? But we can also add here economic, aspects, and we can add any other demographic aspects as well. So the depiction would show that the concept actually might exist and probably would exist most certainly differently in different cultural or national contexts. But there would be also similarities, and that is interesting to note. So what is similar and what is different? So you can see here a particular context and of learning in a natural setting. Okay, so I tried to illustrate these different types of photographs that bring together image and concept that you can, as teachers, give to students to engage with and think about the concept in a different way, and actually diversify their thinking about how they can select images. So moving back to the cycle, because I was talking about the production, investigation, and selection of images, and how to understand these varieties and support diversity in image choices. We will now come to production, and the production is linked to producing narrative. So the first one was image production, and the next one is narrative production in terms of production. So students would write an explanatory narrative, why they chose the image, how the concept and image relate, and it would be coming from their prior knowledge, their personal experience. So that's what we will be engaging students, their prior knowledge, and that would be coming to the surface, which is it which is important, but it may not happen as often that we really understand, their point of view, their interpretations. They can do that individually, they can collaborate, and we can also use narrative prompts or instruction that should trigger critical thinking. And I will just move on to provide the example of instruction for narrative production. So the first thing you can ask students when they produce a narrative is, what are you interested in relation to the concept? Please report that. Think about the concept. What are your first thoughts? What parts of the literature, what kind of literature you have read about the concept that inspired your ideas? Then the next thing is about, how did you select the picture or made a picture? Because a lot of students would choose to photograph things or draw something. It depends also on the type of the image. So report how it was found or created and where it comes from. The next thing is focusing students' attention on picture observation and description. So what can you see in the picture? What details? Identify things, people, action, if there are people's gaze, or positioning of things and their qualities. So what are things like? The interpretation. How do you interpret what you see? Describe the picture and how it relates to your experience. How does it relate to the concept? And finally, we're doing the conceptual inference, these critical insights and reflective insights. So what themes, what conclusions, challenging ideas, or critical insight can you infer about the concept? So you can kind of go back to 1 and 4 and think about it, synthesizes. So this is the kind of instruction that can be provided for narrative production. moving on to what happens next in the cycle. The next thing in the cycle is, sorry, I clicked on that, is sharing and collaboration. So students would do something with their narratives and images. So they will upload them somewhere in a designated digital space. That can be a forum, that can be a WordPress blog or some sort of e-portfolio repository, or they might just send it to the teacher, and the teacher can manage that. So it's entirely, of course, a lot of these things, a lot of the cycle elements and steps are adaptable to teachers' needs. So what do you want to use? What do you want to focus on? Not every single step would be used in the same way. So these can be shared prior or during the discussion. That is the final thing, that kind of final step that closes the cycle. So discussion and feedback, and that constitute also practice as a learning act, as a learning type. So students and tutors discuss the images and narratives. They provide the tutor or peer feedback is provided. They can first do so in pairs, maybe aiming for a collaborative outcome, maybe joint presentation, etc. So there are different ways how to use that, and it's important to mention that these different learning acts that I put in colors, they can overlap, and they usually overlap in activities. So there are no strict boundaries. So some may say, well, investigation is also a type of practice, and I would say yes. And when you do production, you're also practicing, or you can do together collaboration and practice, etc. And that is possible, and that happens. Now I would move on to mapping these things onto different digital tools that are connecting to these different stages. So the acquisition and investigation and production usually is mediated by, in Moodle we have resource lists, and we're using Moodle at Lancaster. So people will engage in reading articles, blogs, YouTube, at this Institute of Educational Sciences search engine, then Wikipedia, Web of Science, or Google Scholar very often, or Google image search. They would do for selecting images, and other things in terms of production would, where you want them to produce these things and how, whether that would be a Word document or it would be by different platforms. And I just present here as a blog platform that can be used both for collaboration and for production. Then Wakelet, which is a more accessible version than Padlet, but Padlet is widely used as a space where to position and share those images and narratives. But how this is done is entirely up to individual teachers, or maybe to do a PowerPoint presentation together and describe in teams how they selected things, what is shared, what is novel in everyone's point of view and in everyone's selection. And then of course when it comes to discussion and feedback for teams, that we are now presenting in teams, and collaboration can also, and sharing, happen in forum spaces as well. So just wanted to map it onto a wide range of tools, which I'm hoping can be useful to you as teachers. So, and I'm aware that this is taking a lot of time, so we can probably stop very soon. So I would just continue to do a couple of examples, how to do an inquiry graphic analysis, when you analyze the image, because I presented the cycle of the activity, but now how to analyze also deserves a little bit of attention. So the familiar example, the familiar image, this is the image that one of my students selected as an iconic image of constructivism, so very similar to the previous one. And the framework for analysis would be something like this. So I just structured it as a sign-based analysis, kind of applied semiotics example, where we analyze photograph as communication signs. So to start with, there is a photographic form that is basically embodied representational form that we can analyze. Then the next thing is the interpretation, so the meaning from decoding these signs. So here would be at the level of connotative meaning, children are doing a chemistry experiment, but we can also do a more descriptive or denotative meaning, such as a boy or the girl are playing with some chemical dishes, they're pouring some liquid. So there are different layers of decoding here that I will be tackling in a moment further. And the object is basically what this form stands for. So of course, these are some children photographed. Probably this is some sort of stock photo purpose, and that is another reason to discuss images as well. You know, what is the purpose of image? So many questions can be asked, but of course these are particular children. We can recognize that they are children for our experiences, some children in the world, you know, different children, but they are very specific children, and that is also important for inquiry. So the next step would be to present how an inquiry graphic as an image concept, analytical item or tool works. So again, I'm giving example of the same image for constructivism, the concept, and that would constitute this image concept sign embodiment. The next step would be linked to what this concept or image refers to. So the image is some children in the world, so refers to some existing children, and the concept is basically many possibilities for constructivism concept meanings. And you can think about all these different questions that we asked earlier when we tried to bring together images and concepts. And then interpretation at this level of image concept relatedness concerns descriptive denotation, connotation of the image, and also object inferences, insights, and meanings. Moving on, I will just give you one example, and that is when we would stop for your conversation and for your, hopefully we will be able to do a little bit of group work, group discussion in relation to your own teaching. So how can we use this image and this framework of representation, interpretation, and, you know, what it refers to? I will show you through this example the same photo again. So when we think about the sign, what is the embodied sign, what is shown, we would list or ask learners to list all the elements you see. Now, what you define as an element is entirely up to you, which level of detail. Is it just naming the biggest kind of surfaces, such as, you know, a boy, but within every human being there are smaller items, eyes, mouths, etc. So it's entirely up to each individual person, but naming all of these smaller items could also lead to interesting you know, discoveries that we think certain things are just taken for granted. What we see can be really taken for granted. And then the denotative type of interpretation, we can describe this entire picture, what is happening in the picture in terms of descriptive adjectives and in terms of verbs to assign different actions to this image. So we are in a way activating the image through these descriptions. So they're holding a glass, they're pouring some sort of the boy is pouring a dark blue liquid, the girl is standing next to him, they appear to be wearing goggles, etc. You know how they look like. And then we do the connotative interpretation. So what does this description mean? Most probably what it reminds us of more kind of socioculturally. So these boys, the children, the boy and girl, they're pupils, most probably, and posing to be pupils. That would be most accurate because this is a stock image. They're posing as pupils, having what is called hands-on experience of chemistry and participating in an experiment. And it's a classical example, the iconic one of constructivist environment. And then we think about it, what possible context that can be in a school lab, who's a mated teacher, and so on. But the interesting thing is how to actually tackle image elements and use image elements for associative and analogical thinking. So here I'm focusing on goggles, which this reflection on constructivism through goggles would be impossible without the image if the image didn't trigger this reflection. So we would think about socio-historical uses and quality of goggles. So why people wear goggles, what are goggles for, how they're used. So usually to protect, and that's where we can devise particular nouns for reflection, such as protection, safety, and ask question of who, how, why, what in relation to these particular insights. To exemplify, wearing goggles represent a protection or health and safety issue in constructivist learning, because we're again referring this to the concept of constructivism that we've been talking about throughout the whole presentation. So elaboration further on this insight would be, well, these issues, health and safety issues, might be an obstruction or a challenge in constructivist learning at schools. And would the children remember to put on goggles independently? Because constructivism really highlights independent learning. So this raises issue of the independent child argument in constructivism, how to tackle that in terms of health and safety. And that comes from the consideration of goggles used for or worn for protection. Generalization and critique would be focusing on solitary children exploration as common in constructive representations, but it needs to be contested or challenged. Adult is omitted, but it still influences the image. So what is the role of teachers' agency and guidance in constructivism, especially to remind the children to protect themselves when they do these experiments? And also, of course, we can think about the role or the positioning of girls in STEM sciences and in STEM. I mean, these are hard sciences, and is this representation of a girl assisting or not? That's again questionable. It may not be. I mean, I would not just necessarily say that it is, but it can raise questions of the kind. This is where I would stop and go to your task, because I have just a few illustrations really to show how this thing can be observed from the perspective of, okay, focus on elements. What are the socio-historical characteristics of elements, how you can use that as an insight. And the handout that I provided, then if you can share with everyone, they detail all the different 11 image concept types. They also present the narrative instruction example, and they summarize the analysis that I did. So that would be linked to the task. I would present briefly the steps, and then we go on to the task. Is that okay? Yes. So the steps that I did in the analysis, I first focused on micro representational existence in the image, and then moved more meso and macro meaning. So the micro is really focusing on elements, noticing, naming, listing individual items, what is presented or represented. So one word per item, so to speak. Then the notation is linked to quality, to appearance of the description. So what are these things like? What do they look like? So we're using adjectives of verbs to energize the image. And then we think about, what adjectives can turn into nouns, what are the synonyms, what are the antonyms, using a little bit of language as well. And then the connotation is the next level. So what does the description mean in context or in different contexts? What are socio-cultural meanings or understanding that we can consider? How has it changed over time? How does your prior knowledge affect this or your own understanding? And then we change these questions and speculate about viewers, about historicity, such as, before and after, or use these different aspects from the image concept types. And finally, this is the concept. So how do all these micro and meso steps inform critical, creative, really creative new insights and reflection about these key concepts and etc. So it's more about analogical, associative, lateral thinking, that we're trying to link these descriptive adjectives, nouns, and elements to the concept and have this deeper reflection. And of course, the more students, the more learners learn about it, they will be more capable of doing that. So in the beginning, they would need a lot of support in terms of tutor feedback, and then later on, they can, after a lot of practice, they can then do this. It would come more easily, but in the beginning it can be a little bit of negotiation and discovery. Okay, and look at this image. I cropped it, as you can see. So actually the teacher is here, and the teacher is important and in constructivism. So our conversational task today is the following. So I think Dan, you tell me what is possible, whether we can have people, I don't know how many people are present, but if we can have few groups, and then that these things are discussed in the group, and then if we can have a little bit of feedback based on this discussion. So I would invite you to identify one key concept in your teaching or your discipline that you wish your students to explore and reflect deeply on. You can also formulate some sort of a challenge or a problem. Then please discuss how to present different aspects of it through different image types. And to help with that, I have provided handouts that actually describe all of the types that I introduced. And of course, how would you implement the activity in your teaching or in your course or module? What would be your adaptation? Because you may wish to adapt. It would be great if you take turns and reflect on the task in terms of how you think it could be useful, how you would use it, how you would adapt it. Maybe you have used something similar before, so that would be great to hear you and your experience. So of course, we can think about using visual media in research as research data. And images can be produced by participants as data. And in the very popular terms, this process is named photo elicitation, but I added in brackets inquiry graphics elicitation. And the main difference is what kind of analytical approach you take to the procedures of interviews or focus groups, interviews schedule, or even that can be embedded, images can be embedded in questionnaires. So basically, photo elicitation or inquiry graphics elicitation is used to elicit or provoke responses from your participants, but it also can be done as researcher driven a method, so that the researcher prepares and shows photographs or any other visual media type, or it can be participant driven, so that you ask participants to provide photographs, provide any other type of media. And I'm saying any other because it can be different thing. It can be a web page. It can be, you may want to analyze how people relate to virtual learning environments. And for that, of course, you can ask participants to be there and talk you through these different functionalities of virtual learning environments, what they notice, what kind of functions they do use or don't use, and how and why, etc. So it can be also both. So that would be some sort of researcher participant driven mixed approach to photo elicitation. So found or existing images can be used as data, and they can be also used as kind of springboards for theorizing, so for your reflection. They are useful because they provoke thinking, they tap into these are sometimes we can say hidden or not easily accessible meanings and conceptions we hold. And when we are asked to interpret something, there is no language to support or to direct our interpretation. So that's why using photographs, for example, is very interesting and useful. Images can be used for feedback and documentation of the research process. So I will just illustrate that. So you can document the process with images or using maybe visual diaries. Um, then images are also useful as a mode of interpretation. So for participant or researchers' interpretation of particular ideas or problems or research questions, and of course as a form of representation of these things. So I would just give few examples before we close. So methodology, what kind of questions would you ask? And I think this is not just I think distinct for inquiry graphics as a method in research, but generally for visual research methods. So start with the research problem and theme and question. So what is it, of course, and then how is this topic visual or material? So how can it be connected with everyday life, with things, with visual representation? Could it be? How can it be? Because of course, not all research topics, not all research problems are best visualized. And decide which nonverbal media can act as triggers to elicit reflection, for example, in interviews or analysis. And decide, will you ask participants to choose, to provide graphic media? So would it be participant driven or kind of photo voice? That's the term commonly used. Or you will prepare those, or it would be both. So you will prepare, but you will also ask participants to provide some visual type of data, and then devise an interview schedule that would embed, for example, the analytical steps of micro, meso, and macro analysis, such an IG. Here is, and then of course we will analyze it. These are some examples of questions that can be used in interviews or focus groups. They would incorporate the logic of that analytical model that we went through. So ask participants what they notice. What individual things and elements are there in a graphic medium? Ask to list individual items and that they see, and then what really captures their attention. So that would lead to identifying salient things in the visual representation. So what is really salient in the representation? And you decide what level of detail you would require or you want to go for when you do this kind of exploratory listing and noticing and then moving on to describing it. So what are these elements of the visual like? And of course, you can give one example to help, because there is a tendency that we interpret immediately photographs in terms of what they mean to us. We are not going these kind of almost reverse engineering, to use the engineering metaphor, from elements, micro level, meso level, then to macro level. We're almost jumping to connotation by default. This means suffering or sadness if there is someone crying in the photograph, but we would need to go back and then analyze and use the elements for reflection. What does it mean in this context and why? And then you can also use all of these different triggers in terms of aspects, speculations, and of course, again, give one example to help people distinguish between these more kind of descriptive, denotative accounts and more connotative and contextual accounts. And then use those speculative questions. What if? Consider that this is in a different context. Consider that the actors are different, that different things are represented. So change these things based on, for example, 11 phototypes, or play with time, with other aspects, socioculture, etc. And do the conceptual object framing in the end. So ask how the participant, ask them to link reflection to any of the key concepts of your inquiry. And of course, you would define that in the way you want, or to the extent you want your concept to be revealed. So you might want to tweak, this connection. And following the steps that I presented earlier, so how you would analyze this. So what elements are participants noticing? What is a salient element? What is shared among participants? Imagine think about giving them one and the same image. So how do different people interpret that one and the same image? So what is most noticed? What is most discussed? And what is not noted? So that can lead to useful insights. And then what are similarities and differences in their descriptions? What are salient descriptive words that they use, adjectives or verbs? And that would lead to how they're interpreting the observed. So what does it mean to them? What kind of meanings and themes can be developed to link to your research questions, which is kind of your research object here. And finally, you're conceptualizing and theorizing this. So what kind of insights have been developed from the image as a whole and its elements, and you are identifying now categories and themes that are very similar to theme analysis. So how can these be conceptualized or theorized? And finally, if you want to read a little bit more about the analysis, there is an article that you can find, is open access article, and it is on analyzing videos in educational research. So it's a bit about generally using multimodal approaches to analyze videos, but it adopts and applies the same logic of infographics steps that I exemplified. And that's it from me today. So let's move the boundaries of knowledge teaching and learning with graphics.
Give Natasha a round of applause. If he can do that, I can do it on my end.
Thank you.
Very good. Yeah, we have another 8 minutes, and we can, anybody wanting to say anything related to this today's talk is very welcome to do so, and be nice for Natasha to kind of maybe just hear our thoughts about the general thing. One thing I wanted to say at the end, that it reminded me the last bit you talked about research and showing people photographs, that Rorschach test, which is in psychiatry and psychology, when you have these ink blobs and then you ask people what they see, and in telling them what they see from these irregular sort of kind of like shapeless images, they kind of then infuse it with their own aspirations, fears, whatever. So you kind of read the insides of their minds. It kind of reminds me of that, but obviously in a very, semiotics is much more like a high structure to that. This is a very sort of but it did kind of remind me of that a little bit in that part.
There are certainly similarities.
Yes. So you're doing psychiatry, applied psychiatry here as well as other things. Yes, I mean, it is influx of senses, as we discussed in the preparation for this talk with the Vygotskian kind of term about influx of sense and how the word in a sentence acquires its meaning to its juxtaposition in the sentence. So like a word can in English language is can of Coke or I can do it. Obviously, two different meanings of that word depending on the juxtaposition. So in many ways, these photographic visual compositions and things, what we see, what we don't notice is always more interesting, I think, than what we do notice in any given piece of text or an image or whatever. So yeah, it's I think this kind of research what's focus is very, it can really cut across many crucial, important, critical thinking areas that we are in desperate need of. Given this fake news, my opinion counts no matter how infactual like it is and so on. I think these kind of remedies are in high demand, at least in my opinion. So yeah, we have about 7 attendees we have 3 guests. They could be anyone.
Yes.
So yeah,
It's great to see that there are guests,
yes,
and you know, we heard from Susie as guests, so
yes.
yes.
One of them, Noam Chomsky. I'm just saying that could be one of the guests. Could be Noam Chomsky. You never know.
Well, we never know exactly, but that reminds me of thinking about you know, the role of media and all the images that we see, and you see this is a really interesting area, because critical media literacy has existed as a concept, as a field for a very long time. However, it still is not a part of how should I put it, like it's not embedded in the curriculum, and it is not embedded either, you know, in schools or in universities. And I think there are a lot of reasons why this is the case, and of course, you know, asking these critical questions can reveal a lot of things that may not be how should I put it, like they would really be critical thinking, serious critical thinking, and critical analysis of the media. And this reminded me of the situation when media actually you know, they do have a really big part, big role in influencing opinions, and also showing particular imagery and kind of ideas of different uh, you know, of different concepts, of different ideologies, of different approaches, of different systems, you know, environments, etc. So it is a very interesting situation where the field exists, but it's somehow it's really struggling to find its way in applied education, and we can think about it, you know, why this is the
Yeah,
case,
as far
and
as you know, as far as
we
it
can.
goes, and you know, I think a lot of it is very political and very sort of for those reasons. And functional literacy is promoted, you know, but critical literacy is demoted and sort of and partly. You know, cutting down funding for a lot of educational programs means that a lot of students are in one place at any given time to any
Yes.
one lecture room, and that really, you know, you can't do critical literacy, you can't develop criticality, you can't humanize that sort of context. You can only just, you know, merely kind of do the functional literacy promotion. For those people who are interested in this critical theory, and that's like an antidote to what's been weaponized psychology, which is Sigmund Freud's kind of thinking and aspirational. It's called manufacturing consent. About 100 years now in operation. It's called manufacturing consent, and how the media has through PR and all sorts of things has mastered this technique of hiding things in the plain view kind of thing, and you know, pretending that the elite's agenda is our agenda and so on. But yeah, it's a bigger field, and
it's a bigger field,
yeah.
definitely, but you know, it all links to the marginalization of the visual in education, especially if we talk about kind of higher level or serious education. And I can tell you from my experience, actually doing this kind of thinking is initially is not easy for students to switch to that form and type of thinking, kind of in-depth thinking, making analogical jumps, inferences, observing the visual in that way, in a very observing concepts in such a different way. But by the end of the whole process, it is usually transformative experience that students report, and yes, but it goes from this, you know, kind of very new or unusual way of thinking towards actually realizing its value. And of course, you know, we cannot do
Yeah,
that all the
the
time.
reason,
You know, we cannot
I
inquire every image, but
kind
yeah.
of give it a positive spin. I think the reason
Yes.
why the system doesn't support critical literacy is because critical literacy tends to disrupt the ways we go about life, right?
Yes.
Whereas system that exists, they want to preserve themselves, and therefore functional literacy just to reproduce the reality, the paradigms of thoughts and practice. So for those reasons, every system has a reason, very good reason, to not to promote this critical literacy. But just to put a positive spin,
Yes.
Because every time I speak of critical literacy and critical theory and critical pedagogy, people are, oh, you're critical, you're moaning all the time, right? No, the other word for criticality is creativity. So creative literacy, to go beyond what is given to you at any given, sort of a sort of context, and to see what made it, what brought it into existence, why is this the way it is, and then you kind of go beyond it. So it's creativity of thought rather than a criticality kind of specifically, but yeah, we are glad to have Natasha, fighting this battle for us, and she's very productive, and that's something that quite a few of us aren't as much as we should be.
Thank you.
It's very good to have you
For having
on our playing for our team. Yeah.